All right, we're going to get started. Welcome to everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the first speaker series event for the academic year here at the Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. My name is Kenji Yoshino. I'm the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law at NYU School of Law, and I'm the director of the center. I'm really pleased that the center will be relaunching as the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging on October 17th. And as part of that, we are expanding our ecosystem of speaker series sponsors. So I'm very, very grateful that we not only have the law firms that we have traditionally had, but we have added some public interest organizations and some corporate sponsors as well, as you can see on this list, which is in fact getting too long to name. So I will let you rely on the visual here. For this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Loretta Ross. Professor Ross is an award-winning, nationally recognized expert on racial justice, women's rights, and human rights. An associate professor of the study of women and gender studies at Smith College, she's written 3 books on reproductive justice: Undivided Rights, Women of Color Organized for Reproductive Justice, Reproductive Justice, an Introduction, and finally, Radical Reproductive Justice, Foundations, Theory, Practice, Critique. She also has a 4th book in the works, Calling in the Calling Out Culture, which has been featured in the New York Times. In addition to her writing, Professor Ross is a prominent activist who co-founded Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective and formerly served as its national coordinator. I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Ross to NYU.
Thanks for having me. Thank
you so much for being with us. Toward the end of today's program, I'll open up for Q&A. So please feel free to submit questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So without further ado, let me dive in here, Professor Ross. Not everyone may be familiar with the term reproductive justice. I think many of us are more familiar with the term reproductive rights. So what does reproductive justice mean, and how does it differ from the more familiar term reproductive rights?
Well, a group of 12 Black women in 1994, of which I was one, coined the term reproductive justice by splicing together reproductive rights and social justice. And the reason we did so was because we were frustrated in how all conversations on abortion were isolated from the social justice issues that surround the lives of women who become pregnant and people who become pregnant. Because if a person has pre-existing human rights violations in her life, like lack of housing or lack of health care or violence from a partner or job or education insecurity, then an unplanned pregnancy can be a tragedy because it could just totally derail their lives. And yet, if they have good answers to those human rights questions, a stable job, education future, childcare, a bedroom to put that child in, that kind of thing, then many people turn an unplanned pregnancy into a wanted child. And so we Black women critique both the pro-life and the pro-choice movement for only starting with the pregnancy, not paying attention to what was going on in the person's life before the pregnancy happened. And so we wanted to use this term reproductive justice as a human rights-based framework to talk about what were the pre-existing human rights concerns in the person's life before the pregnancy occurred, because you have to pay attention upstream to what's going on. Now, once we coined it in 1994, we quickly defined it as having 3 primary tenets. The first one is that we overlap with the pro-choice movement in fighting for the right to abortion, birth control, and abstinence, if you think it works. I'm not a great believer in abstinence, but some people do learn how to abstain. I don't. But anyway, so that means we are not pushing against the pro-choice framework. People mistakenly think we created it as a counter to the pro-choice framework or reproductive rights, which we didn't. It really was about joining them, but also understanding that because it was created by Black women, we had to go beyond fighting for the right not to have a child to the second tenet, fighting for the right to have the children that we want to have. And that's because Black women, ever since the end of slavery, has had our fertility criminalized, as if our children were the source of school problems, crime, terrorism, civil unrest, you name it, everything gets blamed on the wombs of Black women, including the 2008 mortgage crisis. I mean, we just get it all, right? And this eugenical thinking is what we have to push against, that we also call population control. And so fighting for the right to have children and the conditions under which we want to have them, which means using midwives or doulas or having your birthing plans respected, and the right to refuse an unnecessary medical intervention, like a sharp rise in unnecessary C-sections that take place within the US healthcare system. And then the third tenet of reproductive justice, in many ways, is the most capacious, because what happens once the child is born? You know, you have to have safe schools. You have to put an end to gun violence. You have to address environmental problems, tax policies. How are schools funded? You know, what kind of education are the children receiving? What do they have? A safe way to go to school. I mean, those kinds of things. And so the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to raise your children in a safe and healthy environment were the original core tenets of reproductive justice in 1994. And then a decade later, in 2004, our LGBTQ members within Sister Song said, wait a moment, what about adding to the framework in a way that's less womb centric? Because everybody doesn't want to be a parent. So don't we have the right to bodily autonomy, gender identity, sexual pleasure too? And so that became the fourth tenet of reproductive justice. Now, people get confused because there is a correlation between reproductive health, which is service provision to individuals for their healthcare needs, reproductive rights, which is a legal advocacy framework within the constraints of the US Constitution, fighting for the right to keep birth control and abortion safe, legal, and accessible. And then reproductive justice, which is a human rights-based organizing framework. Because our job is to bring into the conversations around reproductive politics all issues like economic justice, environmental justice, food security, all of those other issues that affect our ability to effectively raise the children that are born and that we have. And so it is a paradigm shift, because the biggest shift that we're making is that instead of working within the confines of the US Constitution, we're invoking the global human rights framework, because we believe that the human rights framework offers better protections for our human rights than the limited and yet to really be amended US Constitution that still doesn't even include women. So we are looking beyond the limits of constitutional jurisprudence here in the US and using and learning from the global South how they are effectively using the human rights framework in their fight for reproductive justice.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, and particularly for outlining those four tenets of reproductive justice. This actually directly follows, I think, where in your writings you criticize the emphasis that's often placed on the concept of choice in this arena. So for example, in your book, Reproductive Justice, you argue that choice is, and here I'm going to quote because I love this quote, a flim-flam mantra more suited to describing a commercial transaction than to providing the foundation for female dignity or the signal condition of modern womanhood for all. Close quote. So could you unpack this a little for me? Because it does seem like some of these tenets of reproductive justice would be understood through a framework of choice, the right to choose to have a child, to choose not to have a child, to disaggregate sexuality from a child. So what does a choice framework miss?
Choices is a wonderful aspirational framework if you actually have choices. But if you don't have choices, it doesn't offer a whole lot. Because if a person is from a marginalized community, let's say that you're an undocumented immigrant afraid to go to the hospital for fear of being reported to immigration authorities, that's not a choice not to get prenatal care. It is constrained by your lack of human rights protections. So choices is what we want everybody to have, but we want choices that make sense, choices that respect people's human rights. And so I'm not against people having choices. That's the ideal. But it's a realistic assessment that choices are a function of privilege. That if you don't have those privileges, you don't have those choices. As we're seeing now with all the wave of abortion restrictions across the country in the wake of the Dobbs decision, there will be people who will be able to pick up and go to other states or even other countries to obtain services. They will still have choices, however financially burdensome they are. But then there are a lot more people who will be left out of making choices because they don't have the economic means or the legal means or fear of violence from a partner or a whole lot of other things. Or do I even have the ID to get on a plane to go to another state? That is a problem facing members of my family who aren't legal citizens. So they can't even fly to go anywhere because they don't have a state issued ID. And so choices, I don't problemize choices. I wish we had them.
Right. So in some ways, it may be that the third tenet of the right to parent children in safe and healthy environments, as well as the upstream conditions that you were talking about, may be your real challenge to choice, right? Which is to say, unless we have those systemic, safeguards in place, then choice is kind of meaningless because even if we say, there are no legal restrictions to making this choice, there are going to be structural barriers to even making the choice in the first place. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, the whole concept of choice is problematic because we saw with the Hyde Amendment, Henry Hyde imposed in 1976 that the Supreme Court affirmed in 1977. When abortion was described as a choice, then anti-abortion opponents in Congress said, well, if it's a choice, the government doesn't have to pay for your choices,
Right.
which really set up second-class health care for everyone who depended on the government for health care, whether they're on Indian reservations or in the military or on Peace Corps or all kinds of ways people who were dependent upon the federal government for health care. Why should they get substandard health care because they're engaged with the federal government versus people who are not? And so the choice framework has been weaponized against the most vulnerable populations since 1976, revealing its inadequacies. But at the same time, I tend to want to be very careful about my threat assessments. I don't define as a problem the pro-choice movement. I define as a problem the people who are opposed to women's human rights altogether.
Mhm. Incredibly helpful. So I want to go to the concept of intersectionality. You mentioned earlier that Sister Song was a collective of Black women, and this.
No, I'm sorry. Let me just do a
Oh,
small
please,
correction.
yeah.
Sister Song was a collective of women of color. We were founded by 4 Native American, 4
Oh, wow.
Asian Pacific Islander, 4 Latina, and 4 African American groups, 16 organizations. So we were designed from the outset
Mm.
as a way of bringing together women who had been minoritized by white supremacy.
Mm.
So and as a matter of fact, our original founder is Luz Rodriguez, a Latina.
Mhm.
A Latina. So people, because they've seen me as a visible face of Sister Song, they always assume it's a Black organization, when in
Mm.
fact it's a multiracial organization. And we were founded in 1997, but
Mm.
6 years later, we opened up our ranks to everybody. So we've got white people, men, everybody in Sister Song now.
Thank you for that really important correction. I still want to delve into this notion of intersectionality
Yeah,
because
that's
I mean,
great.
correct me on this too if I'm wrong, but it strikes me as no accident, right? That this really important reframing of the pro-choice, anti-choice debate, where you're talking about reproductive justice rather than simply reproductive freedom, comes out of an intersectional perspective. And in fact, in your writings, you underscore how critical intersectionality is to reproductive justice, not just about race and gender, but also class and other identities, including LGBT, as you mentioned earlier. So can you say a little bit more about that? Can I draw you out on why intersectionality is so critical to your analysis and activism?
Well, when Kimberly Crenshaw coined the concept of intersectionality, she was describing what we'd always felt marginalized people in this society. Fran Bill used to call it double jeopardy, when you're Black and female at the same time. Shirley Chisholm said, when she became president of NARAL, she said, because when I was born, I couldn't decide whether I was a woman or a Black person, that kind of thing. And so when you exist in simultaneous identities, and any of those identities create vulnerabilities for you within a white supremacist hierarchy, that's where you need to use the concept of intersectionality. People think intersectionality is simply a statement of identities. No, we all have multiple compounded identities. I mean, I could be a bagpipe player, and unless bagpipe players are oppressed, that identity is not going to be my intersectional identity. You see what I'm saying? An intersectional identity talks about what you're vulnerable to. So, for example, every child has a human right to an education, but a blind child might need her books in Braille. So you have to pay attention to her intersectional vulnerability to ensure that she has the same human rights as sighted children. And so what Kimberly Crenshaw did was point out how our legal system could not handle multiple axes of vulnerability, whether it was gender, race, class, rural, urban, citizens, all of those kinds of things, and talked about how we need to look at not only how people have different vulnerabilities, but these vulnerabilities can compound each other. And so she gifted this theory, wonderful theory, to the universe. But the thing I say, intersectionality is our process for describing those vulnerabilities, but human rights is our goal.
Yeah, and directly following on that, I know you've said several times that your framework here is the human rights framework, and therefore much more capacious than anything that we do as sort of poor country constitutional law scholars here in the United States. But I suspect that many people are tuning in today because of the Supreme Court's decision last term to overturn Roe versus Wade in the Dobbs case. So I'm wondering how that decision has affected how you think about or advocate for reproductive justice in the United States.
One of the privileges of being a Black woman in the United States is that we've never actually relied on the Supreme Court to deliver justice to us, because we've been frustrated by that hope so many times. And so we were disappointed, but not surprised by the Dobbs decision, because we've always had to fight from Plessy versus Ferguson, Dred Scott, on and on. There was a brief moment with Brown v. Board of Education, and then the backlash to that started with the massive resistance of the South and all of that. And so we're in a very privileged position to always say that our human rights are not dependent upon the legal system of the United States. We have an inherent entitlement to those rights simply because we're human, and the Supreme Court is too reluctant to acknowledge our humanity equal to whom the country was devoted to, kind of like white men at the top and everybody else subordinate to that. And so what we're doing in the wake of the Dobbs decision is, like the song says, sisters are doing it for themselves, like we've always had to do. We've strengthened our midwives and doula networks. We've made sure that people had information to access self-managed abortion through the pills. We have these underground railroads transporting women to other states through our abortion funds that we have across the country. But thousands and thousands of us know how to provide abortions too, because it's not 1973 anymore. You can't unlearn knowledge, no matter how much they want us to roll back in the 20th century. We're not going to go back to the 19th century. It's just not going to happen. And that's one of the things that encourages me, because the opponents to women's human rights mistakenly think that they're fighting us, the human rights movement. But I think they're wrong. I think they're fighting forces much bigger than them, because they're trying to fight time. They're trying to fight truth, and they're trying to fight evidence and history. And any one of those forces could kick their butts. So with time, truth, evidence, and history on our side, I think that we emerge stronger, more determined. We understand the illusion of having SCOTUS protection over our human rights. The only time the Supreme Court has even used the term human rights when it comes to reproductive politics was in a Skinner versus Oklahoma case in 1942, where they said a white man had the right to reproduce and then turns around and affirms sterilization abuse for everybody else, kind of thing. And so we've never put all of our eggs into the SCOTUS basket because we've never been afforded that privilege of relying on the Supreme Court to protect our human rights. We've always had to work around the limits of American jurisprudence rather than count on it to deliver justice.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to be really careful on how I frame this, Professor Ross, because I think of Dobbs as a devastating, decision for so many. But I'm wondering if you see an opportunity here where the removal, right, of Roe allows us to see the broader stakes, right, of your movement and to pivot from thinking about reproductive rights to reproductive justice, right? Because your movement is actually much more capacious than Roe ever was.
I had the privilege once of talking to Sarah Weddington, who was the original attorney who argued Roe, and asked her, because I'm not a lawyer, I'm not even a legal scholar. I mean, I just basically know a few things. I said, why didn't y'all use the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, to argue Roe? Because for a Black woman, involuntarily submitting my body for the health and well-being of somebody else is called slavery. Because no human being should be commanded to make their body hostage to somebody else's body. And Sarah surprised me. She said, we tried to argue the 14th Amendment, and it was the Supreme Court that did not want to write women's equality into the 14th Amendment. And so that's how we ended up with the Roe trimester decision. And so it's always been a problematic decision because it would have been more securely decided, kind of like Canada did, under the auspices of equal protection of the law, instead of setting up a separate category for people capable of becoming pregnant. And that's what they did.
Yeah. Again, really helpful. And yes, my dear friend and former colleague, Reva Siegel, has made a life work out of arguing, as she did in her amicus brief to the Supreme Court in Dobbs, that abortion and reproductive choice should be regarded as an equality issue rather than, or maybe in addition to, a substantive due process issue. So I want to sort of pivot, slightly and to think about what we're seeing in a lot of the organizations that at the center works with. So imagine that I'm a leader, and so I could be the head of a corporation or a law firm or a nonprofit or a university, right? And I've spoken out a lot on issues like, affirmative action or same-sex marriage, right, in favor of the more human rights, advancing notion of those rights. But I worry about speaking out on this issue because I understand that there are strong voices on the other side. So I have, stakeholders on the other side who are adamantly pro-life. I have, colleagues who might object to this position much more vehemently than they would on other issues. So I'm not saying this in a condemnatory way towards leaders who find themselves in that position. I'm just asking you, if I were one of those leaders, what would you coach me to do? What would you say to me?
You have to be true to your values, first of all. If you value democracy, if you value free speech, if you value academic learning, if you value truth and evidence, then you have to be true to those things and not be swayed by political winds of the moment, kind of thing. I find it very difficult for people to stand up in defense of the mission of the academy, for example, to provide the most comprehensive, in-depth education we can, when people are critiquing the very things we need to teach in order to provide that education. I often tell my students in my class, I have a binary choice here. I can either protect you from the truth or teach you how to handle it. I can't do both of those things at the same time. So you get to decide, what kind of professor do you want me to be to you? Do you want me to teach you about the truth, or do you want me to protect you from the truth? Unfortunately, there is a current in our society that is afraid of the truth because their whole currency is lies. That's the only register that they speak in. And so they want to deny the Holocaust. They want to deny the legacy of the enslavement. They want to deny America's imperialist history. They want to deny the fact that we're ruining the planet by not paying attention to climate change. They just want to deny, because believing in those lives was extremely profitable for them. But as people in the academy, our job is to teach the truth and, damn the consequences, because we cannot fail in our overall mission for fear of personal consequences to ourselves. I don't think I would like who I saw in the mirror every day if I ran away from the challenge of defending democracy and human rights.
Well, thank you for that powerful response. So you mentioned your teaching. I'd love to ask you about a course you teach at Smith College, where you talk about a calling in versus calling out distinction, right? And your work on call out culture more generally, right? So you've spoken and written extensively about call out culture, which I think, under some guises might be called sort of cancel culture, right? The idea that we're going to smite people who disagree with us. And instead, in your forthcoming book, you talk about the virtues of calling in. So if I've gotten that right, how do you define calling out and calling in cultures, right? And what is the path forward with regard to choosing between those two alternatives?
Well, first of all, I encourage people not to see it as a binary, that it's actually a continuum. I've created something that I call the 5C continuum. Calling out, of course, is publicly shaming people for something you think that they've done wrong, for which you think they need to be held accountable. This is what the human rights movement does. We basically call out governments or individuals or corporations that violate people's human rights. But what people get wrong about our practices of calling out is that we do it as a last resort, not the first resort. We tried letter writing, we tried talking to people, we tried mobilizations, we try a whole lot of other stuff before we denounce you. Because we're going to give you a chance to change first, and then we denounce you. The problem with the call out culture is that it doesn't give anybody a chance to change. It kind of expects you to already have grown, already to know everything, already to be accountable, already to know what landmines are under your feet. It doesn't allow people to grow, and it penalizes people for the perception of mistakes. It doesn't even have to actually be a mistake, just the perception of a mistake gets people called out. Now, the second C is canceling, because that's when you not only want to hold somebody accountable for something that you think they've done wrong, but you want them to suffer for it. Just the same way the prison industrial complex wants them to suffer. So you want them to be exiled, socially ignored, forgotten, deplatformed, lose a job, lose a reputation, and under McCarthy period, lose a life sometimes, and so that's the ultimate call out, is the cancel culture. But unfortunately, the cancel culture doesn't work for big and powerful people. They laugh all the way to the bank because the notoriety increases their revenue, kind of thing. And so it's a very frustrating act to want to cancel people. Only the vulnerable actually get canceled. And most of the cancellations go from the right to the left. When you look at the attacks on university professors, there are more progressive left university professors who are terminated and attacked than there are right-wing professors who are terminated and attacked. So it all seems to go from the right to the left, not evenly across the board. The third C is calling in. Calling in is actually a calling out, but instead of doing it with anger, blaming, and shaming, you're using love and respect. So instead of saying, I can't believe you just said that word, we don't use it anymore. I can't believe you got my gender pronoun wrong. How dare you? That kind of outrage response. You just remain calm, self-assess, and say something that continues the conversation, kind of like, that's an interesting point of view you just shared. Can you tell me more about it? with that, you're acknowledging that you can hear somebody without agreeing with them because you want to continue the conversation. And the person you're talking to has their body of lived experiences that made them have an opinion, just like you having a body of experiences that made you have an opinion. And so it's a way of exchanging ideas and opinions without violating each other's humanity. So I call it a calling in is just a call out done with love, because you're still pursuing accountability, but you're not dehumanizing people in the process of that accountability. The fourth C is calling on, and this was actually created by Sonia Renee Taylor, the author of the book, The Body is Not an Apology. And she says that sometimes you don't want to make the emotional or attention investment into people to either call them in or call them out, because both of those require your time and attention. Sometimes you just want to call on people to do better. And so that means that instead of assuming that you will do the work to help somebody grow, you leave them to do the work themselves. So you can call on somebody, for example, to reconcile their inner good opinion of themselves with the words that just came out of their mouth. I know you think you're a great person, but why do you think all Black people are criminals? I know you think you're a good person, but why do you think all queer people are trying to be predators on your child? Those kinds of things. And that's calling on people to address their own cognitive dissonance between who they think they are and how they behave. And then the fifth C is my favorite, and I don't think we do enough of it, and that's calling it off. We have no obligation to engage in unproductive conversations with people acting in bad faith, who have no relationship to the truth, evidence, time, or history, who are willing to mendaciously offer alternative facts, and who really are trolling us and gaslighting us because they want to win at all costs, even if it means lying and hurting people and all of that. So whether it's on the internet or in person, you should reserve for yourself the option to call it off. You can call it off permanently or temporarily. You can say, I don't have the bandwidth for this right now, or I will never have the bandwidth to have this conversation with you again. And so we teach these in my online classes, LorettaJRoss.com, if you want to sign up for them. They're $5 a lecture. The whole package is only $20. I call myself the Walmart of consciousness raising. But anyway, this is what we offer. People need to know they have an option, a buffet of menu choices that they can select from when they're dealing with an injustice that speaks to how they are. Because a lot of people mistakenly think that you call people in because of who they are. No, you call people in because of who you are, how you want to walk through the world, how you want to be accountable for the lacerations in your own life, and how you don't want somebody else's dirty fingerprints deciding how you're going to interact with people, even people that you disagree with.
Thank you. So I think I know parts of the answer to this, but I now want to sort of thread the two themes together and say, how do these 5 C's relate to your work on reproductive justice? So we're obviously living in a time where many people feel like the battle lines have just been drawn, right? And they're much more focused on fighting hard against their opponents, right? And calling them out or canceling them, I suppose, or maybe calling it off rather than calling them in, right? Or calling on them. So what does calling on somebody or calling, somebody in the reproductive justice movement look like?
In 1987 at Howard University, I organized the first national conference on women of color and reproductive rights. And the anti-abortion movement decided to send 5 Black women to picket my conference at Howard University. Now, since they were on private land, I could have had them arrested, because you don't just show up on private campus property and establish a picket. I could have called the Metro Police or Capitol Police. I went outside and talked to them and called them in. I said, why don't y'all come in and hear what other women of color are saying about abortion? 4 of the 5 accepted my invitation, stayed for the entire conference, and they have never sent another picket to anything I've ever done, because I'll go outside and talk to their people. And that requires parsing the definition of pro-life. Because see, excuse me, my organization, Sister Song, was co-founded by people who are both pro-choice and pro-life. Yeah, people don't realize that. They assume that everybody who founded Sister Song was pro-choice, and that's not true. But they were pro-life in a way that we could work with, because they said, I wouldn't have an abortion personally, but I would not stop somebody else from doing so. And that's a pro-life position I can resonate with, because you're not trying to impose your religion or your moral choices on someone else's body, on someone else's life. And so I tend to be very precise. When you are opposed to abortion and you're trying to legislate the bodies beyond yourself, that's anti-abortion. But when you are saying, I can make a choice about what I do with my body and still not mandate that everybody else makes the same choice, then you're pro-life in a way that I can respect. I even got into a bit of a controversy because with my last book, Radical Reproductive Justice, I included pro-life authors in there. And people were the pro-choice movement was a little angry at me for that. Why are you giving them space? Doesn't the pro-life movement have enough printed material and space and stuff like that? I said, but yeah, look at what they're saying. They don't support tenet 1, the right to an abortion, but they are full-throated in support of tenets 2 and 3. And so how can we not include them in our movement, kind of thing? And so I've always used calling in. I didn't know there was a name for it until I started intentionally studying it. But you know, in my 20s, I directed a rape crisis center as a rape and incest survivor. And yet I helped establish a program called Prisoners Against Rape that was created by incarcerated Black men who raped and murdered Black women. And I didn't think I had the courage to do that. I actually went into that prison thinking I was going to change them. And I left being changed myself, because I had learned to rehumanize people that I thought of as disposable because they raped and murdered Black women. And so I think that's what I'm drawn to, trying to build bridges, trying to be the best person I can be in the midst of working on this important work. I mean, the thing I tell young people all the time, please accept the beauty of the human rights movement, because it's a perfect framework we're working on. We can be our imperfect selves doing this perfect work for justice. That doesn't mean it doesn't, need work. I mean, it's a state-based system that has its weaknesses. The United Nations has its weaknesses. There's lack of compliance or ratification of treaties. I mean, we could all talk about what's wrong with the human rights regime, but at the same time, this is the collective wisdom of mankind coming together to decide how we should treat each other. And it drew on every religious tradition in the world, every philosophical tradition in the world after World War II, when the world recognized that our current international law was not adequate enough to protect against genocides. It was almost like a Vegas rule. What happened within a country stayed within a country under that whole Treaty of Westphal and that sovereignty thing. And the human rights framework said, no matter where you're born, no matter what you're born, no matter your religion, as long as you are a human being, you have the same inalienable human rights. And so that's a beautiful framework that is so underperforming in the United States. I think the reason it underperforms in the United States, well, there's several of them, but I think one of the major reasons is that people see it as a legal framework first. And our legal system is not ready to acknowledge human rights. But frankly, the most important uses of the human rights framework, in my opinion, start with moral definitions. What do human beings deserve? Do they deserve food, housing, freedom from violence, healthcare, education, those kinds of things? And then we need to infuse human rights into our political system so that we elect candidates who tell us how many children they're going to send to college instead of how many children they're going to send to jail. That use human rights as a political stance. And only then will it percolate up into the legal system so that we finally get the laws that are worthy of us.
One of the things that I'm so struck by, both in your work and your comments today, is the deep sort of hopefulness, right, of your message and your tone. So given the political and cultural landscape that we're living in, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the future of reproductive justice? I'm hoping that, you're going to give us some hope here. And
Well, I'm
then
always a
my
hopeful
last
person.
question, I'll just conflate the last two so we can get to the questions because we have a long queue of questions. I'll just also ask as a tag to that, if I may, what's a call to action? What do you want people listening, regardless of how hopeful or pessimistic you are? What do you want people listening today to do?
Well, I have to give a kind of protracted answer to your question.
Please.
My mother and father were poor, raised 8 kids, sacrificed a lot. My mother cleaned white folks' houses on her hands and knees while she raised 8 kids. So there's no way I could ever argue that my life is harder than my mother's life. That to me is a sign of progress from a personal point of view. That doesn't mean that we're through or that we've overcome or any of those things, but I have an immediate visceral connection to my ancestors and what they had to go through. Another thing that I rely on is a saying from the civil rights movement. Stop imagining that you're the entire chain of freedom, because that chain of freedom stretches back towards the ancestors and stretches forward to your descendants. What you have to focus on is being the strongest link in the chain of freedom so that the chain of freedom doesn't break with you. And that narrows for me what I need to be responsible for. I'm not responsible for the future. I'm not responsible for the past, but I can do what I can do in this moment to make sure the chain doesn't break at my link. All right. And that's something that the civil rights movement says all the time. We ain't no ways tired. We've been put on this earth to do this thing so that our descendants can be proud of their ancestors, kind of thing. Now, that doesn't mean my class that I teach at Smith is called White Supremacy in the Age of Trump, by the way. And of course, I'm looking at the vomit of America all the time, the neo-fascist movement, the KKK, the Patriot movement, the oath breakers. Well, they call themselves oath keepers. I call them oath breakers. But anyway, all of that all the time. This is what I'm teaching to those students at Smith. And I always say, I'm going to teach you the truth so that you can maintain hope. Because hope is what gets us through learning about these uncomfortable truths, knowing that we have the power, the agency to do things differently and make things better. Education is the practice of freedom. I think that's what Paulo Freire said. And so I'm an optimistic person. That doesn't mean that I don't cry when I see the horrible things human beings do to each other. But I also believe that human beings are better than the worst thing they've ever done too. Because I have talked to some very unredeemable people and have found very surprising deaths to them. And so I want to give them the benefit of the doubt, like people have given me the benefit of the doubt. And so you really do need to teach people hope. The thing that I think challenges that is that particularly young people, they think they're in control of the timeline. They think that things should be happening when they expect it to happen. And that's, of course, never going to be the case. It's harder to change human hearts and minds than it is to defy gravity. It's really hard work because all social justice work is just one big experiment in changing hearts and minds. And so 99 things out of 100 we try will fail. But that's okay, because that one thing that works is going to lead you to the next thing that works. And so I have a lot, and I'll say this, and I'll shut up and allow time Q&A. One of my mentors is a man named Leonard Zeskin, and he taught me everything I needed to know about doing anti-fascist work. And we had just come from Blakely, Georgia, investigating the death of a 5-year-old child in a fire when the fire department was only 2 blocks from that child's house. And the fire department was being run by the Ku Klux Klan. And so this child died unnecessarily in a fire, 2 blocks away, because the fire department didn't come till an hour later. And I was so depressed after that. And Leonard pulled me aside. He said, Loretta, you need to lighten up. Fighting Nazis should be fun. It's being a Nazi that sucks. And he made me laugh and he made me keep it in perspective. So if you're not having fun fighting evil, if you're not having fun challenging injustice, then you're doing something wrong, because you're on the right side of history and you're on the right side of justice, and you should be able to find joy in those millions of ways people treat each other well, even as you're looking at the ugly things people do.
Thank you for that. So I'm now going to turn to the audience questions. And the first one is very topical. So the midterms are approaching. How can Democrats strategically best handle the Herschel Walker situation? So this is the Senate candidate in Georgia who said he was adamantly pro-life and then turned out, at least allegedly, paid individual to have an abortion, right? When it was the result of his conduct that the abortion needed to take place.
And the woman who had the abortion also went on to have one of his children that he refused to claim paternity on until she sued him for it. So she's coming out with more and more details. But
yeah, so the question is like, what do you think of this entire situation in general? But I'm also, if I can add a riff on that, like, of your 5 Cs, like, how do we choose which one to use? Do we call them out? Do we call them in?
Well, no, a Herschel Walker would be to call it off, because he's not operating in good faith. Lies is his currency. You're never going to win a debate with someone who only knows how to lie. Right? Why would you even want to go there and spend your energy? The question that I would focus my energy on is people affected by his lies, influenced by his lies. And I would probably make it an issue of character. Because if I can't trust you to tell me the truth about what you've done in your life, how can I trust you to tell me the truth about what you're going to do in Congress? I would make it definitely an issue of character. I would make it an issue of abortion rights. I would make it an issue of his failure to take care of his family, and the fact that his own son is out against him. I mean, Republicans end up with a whole lot of their family members who don't want them to run for office because their family members know who they really are. That happens over and over again. And so I vote in Georgia. So obviously the Georgia elections are very important to me. And I'm putting all of my energy into making sure that there's a blue tsunami, because we have such massive voter suppression in Georgia that just having a narrow election is not going to be good enough, because they're going to claim it was stolen anyway if they lose, because that's already their playbook. And so we just need to overwhelmingly vote. I don't know what white Georgia is going to do, because they seem to be largely split over Warnock and Walker, but we know what black Georgia is going to do, because we saw the election stolen a few years ago, and we have not forgotten that the Secretary of State refereed his own election to governorship. We're not going to forget that. And that voting rights is the ultimate exercise of power in a democracy. And we have died for that. We have marched for that. We have prayed for that. And we are not going to let people just take that away from us without offering massive resistance that we can offer.
Thank you. So here's another question. I realize that you have said that you're not a lawyer, but I think I joined this person in saying, I bet you have really good advice for us as lawyers. And the question is, do you have any advice for lawyers for how to argue for the human rights framework that you've just so eloquently elaborated on here in the United States?
I have been desperately seeking lawyers of courage, because what I find frustrating is that in law schools, apparently winnability is key. We need lawyers who are going to take cases that they know they're going to lose, because we are dealing with the reluctance of our judicial system to acknowledge and accept people's human rights. And so we need to train people how you can grasp victory out of a defeat. That just even arguing that people have a moral right to human rights is a victory. So you're going to have to abandon that winning at all costs kind of thinking that limits what cases you take on for fear that you can't win and stuff. And we really need to litigate food as a human right, housing as a human right, healthcare as a human right, workers' rights as a human right. environmental justice as a human right. If we don't litigate those things, we will never achieve them judicially. And so I've always wanted there to be lawyers of courage. And I'm probably going to get into trouble this way. Back in the 1990s, when I was doing anti-Klan monitoring with Reverend C.T. Vivian, there was a town in Texas called Vidor, Texas, that was trying to attract Black residents to the town, which had been predominantly white, even though they had a huge stock of public housing. It was only available for white people because there was a huge Klan presence in Vidor, and they really wanted to keep Vidor white. And when we were trying to help Black people deal with the racist violence and stuff that they were encountering as they were trying to move into Vidor, we had a civil liberties organization that I'll leave unnamed come to the defense of the Klan instead of coming to the defense of the victims of the Klan. There's something wrong when your belief in absolute principles trumps people's human rights to live where they need to live. I mean, defining the Klan as anything but racial terrorists, not free speech champions, is so distorted in our movement. And so we need lawyers of courage so that I'm not, right now, if someone came to me and they said they were a victim of hate crime, I don't even know where I would call to ask to offer them legal assistance, because there's no institution that sets up legal services for victims of hate crimes. Why does that not exist in our society?
Lawyers of courage, thank you for that. So here's another question. How do you convince someone who views sex not as a recreational activity, but as a divine or miraculous gift of reproductive privilege, and therefore sees abortion negatively as an act of denying potential life or escaping the responsibility of raising a child that comes from exercising reproductive privilege?
Well, I wish they had better sex, frankly, but that might be a start. Sex is something that was gifted to us. And I have to honestly say that I've had my thinking around this challenged because I became pregnant at 14 through incest. And in 1968, I didn't have a lot of choices. The only choice I had was whether to keep the child after he was born or whether to give him up for adoption. I chose to keep my son because I bonded with him. After the morning after he was born, they brought him to me and I saw my face in his face. And I chose to keep my son. But that is the world's worst way to become a mother, because my son never received what every child deserves, and that's unconditional love from their mom. Because I had to co-parent with my rapist for the 47 years my son lived. I was always, my love for him was always compromised by the circumstances of his birth. Nobody wishes that on a child. And my son and I had to painfully construct a relationship despite the circumstances of his birth. And it turns out that his father was a serial pedophile. He had made 2 other teenage women pregnant, even while he was married with 3 children. And so I lived the reality that many people only have as theory. And I know the cost it was to raise my son, the cost to my child, for being the son of rape and incest. We worked through it as a family. Thank God my mother and father saw I was a baby raising a baby, so they co-parented with me and all of those things. But I had that kind of privilege. Not everybody has that privilege to have, strong parents who can back them up when it's a baby having a baby kind of thing. And so I tend to say that is your moral position, but I have the right to say that my lived experiences are different than yours. And I come from what it's actually like to raise a child of rape and incest, and how it cost both me and my son what should have been the best relationship in the world. And it doesn't mean we didn't love each other. We loved each other dearly. But at the same time, he deserved unconditional love from his mother, and he never got it. And we had to talk about why.
So thank you so much for that. I'm sort of caught between two questions. So let me ask a specific one and then a final, more general one. So this is comes actually from a dear colleague of mine saying, I'd love to hear more about why equality or the equal protection claims could more successfully further a reproductive justice agenda that includes abortion. Like, what are we losing when we don't talk about equality is what I hear in that question.
Basically, when you say a particular person's status lessens the rights that they have, you're violating principles of equality. I should not have fewer rights because I'm capable of becoming pregnant. I shouldn't have fewer rights simply because the border crossed me instead of me crossing the border if I lived in Mexico. I shouldn't have fewer rights because I choose to love someone who's of the same sex. You either believe in equality or you don't. And when you try to say that you only believe in equality for the people who behave the way you want them to behave or make the choices you want them to make or have the identity that you can relate to, then you don't believe in equality. You believe in Herren folk. You believe in equality for people that I can relate to, that know me and I know them, kind of thing. And that is the cornerstone of white supremacy, only establishing a circle of concern for people that you can relate to and who relate to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to conflate a comment and a question. The comment is, Loretta, Professor Ross, could you please teach the whole world how to get along? What an inspiration you are, such a loving way to handle discord. Thank you. I think the question that directly follows from that, I hardly agree with that sentiment, is what's the way forward? Could you give us some parting words? What can we take away and do today or tomorrow, right? That would be helpful, right, for reproductive justice or social justice more generally.
I believe we need to all analyze our spheres of influence. I think that most of us who are liberal, progressive, we exist in a 90% bubble. And 90%, I call it that because we have a high degree of unity within that bubble. We recognize our own intergroup language like heteropatriarchy or neoliberal capitalism or misogyny or transphobia. I mean, we talk this in-group language. Outside of us are what I call the 75 percenters. They don't share our intergroup language, but they overlap our values. So for me as an ardent feminist who believes in abortion rights, the Girl Scouts would be my 75 percenters. They may not ever lead a troop to defend an abortion clinic, but they do believe in women and girls empowerment. So I need to figure out how to talk to them without all of this off-putting language that I use in my 90% circle, right? I want to talk to them in regular terms. Outside of those 75 percenters are what I call the 50 percenters. My parents were 50 percenters because they were very militaristic. My dad was in the Army for 26 years. My mother was a Southern evangelical Christian. So instead of paying attention to the words that came out of my parents' mouth, I dove underneath their words and talked to their values. So for example, my mother always made us go to church and prepare food for homeless people. But she couldn't understand why I became a human rights activist because she thought that people who did the work I did went to jail and got killed like Dr. King. Why don't we just melt in, assimilate, work our 5 jobs and not stick out kind of thing. That was mom's thing. And pray to Jesus kind of thing. And I finally had to break down what I did to my mom. I said, Mom, you feed the hungry. And as a human rights activist, I just asked why they're hungry in the first place. And she got it. She got it because I was speaking to her values, not her resistance to talking about abortion, not trying to teach her the whole alphabet soup of LGBT issues, not trying to call her an imperialist dog wife because my daddy was in the military for 26 years. So my family taught me to have conversations with the 50 percenters, and I call them 50 percenters because they could go to the left or the right, depending on who last influenced them. Because my mother also sent money to Oral Roberts because she believed in faith healing and then expected me to pay the light bill when the lights were getting ready to get cut off. So there was that as well. Outside of the 50 percenters are the 25 percenters. These are the people for whom we don't share enough worldview to have any influence over. I mean, while I'm saying we need to defend democracy, they're saying Trump's election was stolen. So they're not even working with the same set of facts that I'm working with. And so I don't tend to try to influence them because we don't have any common register to talk in. And then outside of 25 percenters are the 0%ers. These are the openly about Nazis, racist people who want to deconstruct and destroy democracy if they can't monopolize it. And so I say our step forward is to figure out how to work from the 50 to the 90% range. Because what's going to happen is that the 90 percenters are going to influence the 75 percenters, and the 75 percenters are going to influence the 50 percenters. And there is a chance that the 50 percenters will influence the 25 percenters. So I'm not trying to talk to the zeros. I'm trying to out organize and overpower the zeros, you know, but I'm going to talk to everybody else from 25% on up, because I think speaking to their values, their humanity, acknowledging their suffering and taking it as seriously as I take my own is the way to build common ground with them and move forward.
It's a beautiful place to end and a wonderful call to action to stretch our circumferences of influence, you know, but not so far that they go beyond recognition or plausibility. So I appreciate you. This brings us to a close. I want to thank Professor Ross for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure and a privilege to speak with you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye now.